Hello, everyone. BentonReed here, back with another speed draw. Today we've got a spooky little number that I wanted to do in a monochrome style that I've been playing with, and the composition of it is heavily inspired by one of my favorite pieces of art, period, which is one of the illustrations that Gustave Dore did for Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. So I love Gustave Dore. I love everything he's ever done, but I also love Edgar Allan Poe. So this piece is really nice and really in my wheelhouse, and I wanted to do something inspired by it in this style I've been playing with. So let's get started. So I was inspired by the Dore piece, but I also wanted to take some of the pose information from the statue of Augustus at Prima Porta, which, if you know the statue, you'll recognize the pose pretty quickly, even though I modify it slightly. You'll see the influence. So right now I'm just doing a basic grid transfer of the pose just to get the basic proportions in. Obviously the statue of Augustus is not a skeleton, so I'm transforming it into a skeleton based on the body proportions in the statue, and I just kind of block that out really simply, and then I start shading in the skull. So the style that I'm working in, this monochrome style that I'm working in, is very much a simple but not easy style. It's inspired by some exercises that I did a lot in drawing classes in college, where you would have your white Conte crayon and your black Conte crayon, and you'd have a neutral ground, either gray or brown, and you'd just draw things using only those two colors. And so this is a modification of that with a dark red ground and using black and a saturated bright red instead of a white. So you really get this nice monochrome, and you're really focused on creating value shifts through blending rather than through changing of color or changing of the value of your tool. So it's a really good exercise for understanding value and simplifying forms. So I'm just starting to lay in the bones, starting with the skull and then the rib cage there, which rib cages are always fun. I go onto the spine, make it way too big the first time around. I do my little zoom out and I was like, boy howdy, he's got a big old back. I trim his spine up a little bit, just a little bit as one does. Get that nice and in, and I'm really not going for like super realistic bones here. I'm really just trying to get a stylized kind of sense. There will be some things that I go through and change, and I'm trying to mostly get accurate the number of bones, but especially on the hands and feet, you'll see that I don't do that. And you can see me just checking the proportions. There's the Augustus of Prima Porta coming in, swooping in, and here's where I forget which brush I used on my last drawing session. So I'm having to dig through the brushes to see which one I used. And it ended up being, I'm going to forget it again, it ended up being the graphite stick in the Kyle Mega Pack. I'm pretty sure, just graphite stick by itself, not graphite stick 2. I'm pretty sure, but don't quote me on that. Go look at my stream VODs from these sessions, because I definitely say it correctly in there. But I do these shoulder blades, and getting the size on these took a couple tries. You can see me make them way too small, and then way too big, and then slowly get my Goldilocks just right size. And then first arm, left arm, which I'm just going to do the upper section of, the humerus, because you are not going to be able to see the radius and the ulna underneath the little draped fabric that's going to go across his body. So I just do the upper arm bone and then the hand. And I start out just doing kind of a limp hand, and then I realize that I want him to be holding the hourglass from the Dore piece. So I curl the hand up so we can have this rope inside of his hand, down onto the legs, and starting with the femur, I make it a little bit fat. You got a big fat leg bone at first, and then I kind of trim it up and get it a little bit more proportional as I go down to the tibia and the fibia. And I'm not going to name the bones of the foot. I used to be able to, but I can't anymore. And also, I didn't even draw them. I kind of just drew a shape and put some texture on it, because the foot is a tiny little thing in this composition, and it's also not important. And so I kind of just draw a collection of shapes. Then onto the right arm, doing the full arm, humerus, radius, ulna, and then trying to get this hand wrapped around the handle shaft of the scythe, This definitely took me a while to get right, and the value's a little bit off in the final piece, I think, but the size is mostly correct. At first, his hands were way too tiny, and they kept being consistently too tiny. So I got a rendered style that I liked, that looked okay, and then I just made it a little bit bigger. And you see me get his hips back in a little bit, because his hips were a little bit too wide. And then onto the right leg, which by this point I was in the zone, and I was just cranking out bones, bone after bone after bone. And I just kind of rough things in, get the scythe handle nice and straight. That's one nice thing about doing digital, is that I can get really solid straight lines. The blade, and I'm going for, just enough detail to get that metallic sense, which is difficult to do when you only have 2 colors to get that kind of metallic haze glow. But I think I did a pretty good job with it. And then I decide to add a traditional golden halo, because I love putting it in my work. It's my little pretentious thing that I put in a lot of my pieces. And so I add it, I go back and refine it a little later, and you saw me try to do an undercolor to see if it would work, how it's worked in some other pieces I've done in this style, but it didn't. And I try it a bunch of times in a bunch of different places, and it never works. I end up doing a version of it in the end piece, but it not really that way. Then I start on the fabric, and you can already kind of tell, I busted this fabric out, which I was not expecting to be able to do, because fabric usually gives me a lot of problems, but I was smart, and I remembered my training, and I blocked it out, and I started with the really big shapes, and then I refined. So it came out really nicely. You can see me try that underpainting again and just not do it. It's not going to work. I decided it's not going to work. But I start to refine the rest of the fabric, keeping that same strategy of just blocking out the really big shapes and slowly adding in the details. So I kind of just take each major section, portion it out. You can already start to see some of the detail, and then just slowly add in the big highlights, from the big shapes to even smaller shapes to smaller and smaller shapes, starting with the highlights and then adding in the shadow for detail and texture. And I think it came out a lot better than I was honestly expecting. So I'm very happy with the rendering of the fabric. And it naturally kind of developed a much lighter value, which you'll see if I ever flash it to black and white again, you'll see the lighter value of the fabric over the bones. I think that too really worked really well. There is going to be a major change to the fabric before I get to the end, but I'm going to keep it a secret for now. Yeah, this is kind of just that, not to say it's a simple process, but that repetitive fabric rendering process of just setting in folds and wrinkles and all this different kind of stuff. I was kind of roughly going off of the reference photo. This is the big element that's taken from the Augustus of Prima Porta, this fabric that he has draped over himself. And there's a moment where I realize right here that, Augustus is a real person. He's not see-through, but this is a skeleton. He's very see-through. So I have to go through and really kind of refine and in some places make up the fabric that goes behind him, because you can actually see it. That's the basics of the pose. I do some refinement, and then I add the hourglass. I almost said lighthouse for some reason. The hourglass, that's a reference to the Dore piece. Very simple shapes, very simple structure, not too much detail. It's such a small little thing, and I want it to kind of come forward that I give it just so much highlight. And there you have the very basic shape, and this is where I start futzing. So I get the background laid in, and I take a little bit of the rest of it, and I kind of go back and forth. So I wanted to do this planetary element that's in the Dore piece, and so I do this kind of disc that he's standing on, or this spotlight that he's standing in, kind of give that element, black out the sky behind him, try the underpainting again, hate it, abandon it, play around with some things and just don't really like any of them, but I'll come to something that I like with it later. I blow up the halo, add a little bit more detail so it has just a little bit more texture and piece to it, and I'll add some stars to the background, a very light amount of glow, and then then comes, I think, the piece that I like. A little bit of shadow there. Oh no, I fixed the skull first. I forgot what order I did things in. I go back and fix the skull first. I'm much happier with how it turned out in the end. It just had a lot better look versus the planes in the first edition just did not work very well. And then, this is the big shift that I was working up towards. I decided to take the fabric and using a hue saturation layer, turn it to this same kind of gold yellow as the halo. I think it does a really good job of contrasting with the red while staying kind of in the same color family, this very warm tone, and I think it adds a nice little element. I really like the yellow pop from the halo, and I wanted to kind of bring it out somewhere else. So bringing it out in the fabric just kind of made sense. And that's my cute little Reaper drawing that I did, and I hope you enjoyed. See you next time.